Hello everyone, I'm Said. In this video, I'm going to show you how to mock a class, but only part of that, not all the methods inside the class. You may already using lots of ways to do that, but in this video, I'm going to show you how we can use NSubstitute NuGet package to mock only part of a class. Here I have an API for getting users that simply just we send a username and our service going to get user first from database and also calling GitHub API for getting extra information for that user. For example, here from DB, I just mark the response, name and email, and also for the GitHub, I'm calling the actual GitHub API for getting extra information about the user. So think about it like this. Here I'm using the GitHub API, but maybe in your project, you're calling third-party APIs that maybe it has some limitation to call it. So you need to be careful when you're writing tests and not calling that API actually, right? Let's run the project first and see the result of this API. I'm going to call it from the Postman for my username. And if I call that, it's going to call the GitHub API and returning Saeed Ismailejad, my test email, and also GitHub followers and GitHub user ID. So part of the response coming from database and the other part is from the third-party API, which is here, the GitHub. Okay. I'm going to write the integration test for this API. So usually it's like that, very simple, no need to do anything here, just for testing. I just create one web application factory, no overwriting for the test services, and here is our test. Let's run test first. I'm gonna put some breakpoint here, database, and also GitHub. And here I'm going to debug the test. So usually when you want to write the integration test, you should not mock any part of your code because the point for using integration test is for running all code scenarios and executing the real code, right? That's the reason for having the integration test. Here, username is SAESIR and then getting user from database, going for GitHub API, getting response and just putting the followers and then GitHub user ID, right? And test is passed successfully. But here is the problem. The problem is every time that we are calling the API, also we are calling the third-party API as well. So we need to find a way to just skip that step, skipping this method, right? Because it doesn't make sense. Maybe you have 1,000 integration tests, so every time you're gonna call this API, no, it's not correct. What we can do here, as I mentioned, maybe you are doing different ways to do that. Actually, there are a few ways to do that. So let's consider one by one. And at the end, I'm gonna use the NSubstitute for mocking only part of the class. That's the roadmap of this video. We have one interface that is calling the, we have one method, and then this is the implementation of that interface, right? So first one is using mock, completely mocking this interface, and then mock this method as well, so that you're gonna skip all of this logic in this class, which is not a good idea. And second one, we can say, okay, we have this interface. We are going to just copy paste all of the code here. For example, if I'm going to show you, so for example, we are going to say test user service here, and then we are going to user service so that actually we are going to implement our own test user service. But we need to have all the details here, copy and then paste it here. And just we can remove this API calling and then return some, test data. But that's a very bad idea because you are duplicating your code here in the test project and also in your main project, so that every time that you are going to change some logic here, you need to do that in the test as well. That is definitely not a good idea. The next idea is, I'm just going to, talking about the other ways, and then we can talk about the NSubstitute at the end. Another point here is we can actually inheriting from the user service itself. So we can say, instead of implementing the interface, we can simply say, what about this? If we have, let's just remove all the methods here. And then here we have class user service. We need to implement a constructor. What else we can do? We can say, okay, we are going to have all the methods in the base class, which is the user service, but we are going to override only that method. For example, here, get user from GitHub, we can say something like this. But here is the problem. Get user from GitHub is private. In this class, we are using the private modifier, and actually this is the limitation and there is nothing to do with it. We have to make it either protected or public. Also, we need to make it virtual so that we can override it. Here we can override that method by using the protect override, and then actually we are changing the main class behavior. That's it. I think here the warning is because we should specify, return type of the task. So that's working fine, and actually is not bad idea. And some of the places I'm using this approach as well. And that's it. I know that if we use these things here, for example, if we already register test user service implementation for this service, is going to override the previous one, but it's safe to just remove first all of them. Maybe in some of the places in your code base, you are injecting enumerable of your services. For me, it's always like that. Don't take risk for the other places, and it's better to remove all the services first and then register it again, right? Let's go here and run the test. I'm expected to hit this breakpoint because we already override the method. So if I debug the test, okay, yes, this is the test user service. Okay, fine. We could override this method to not calling that third-party API. What we can do other than this way is using wiremock.net, the NuGet package, which is really great package to running a web server locally, and then we can just put the URL or mocking the local host and then calling the GitHub API, just simulating the server, the third-party API. That is fine, is another way, but in this video I'm not going to cover that one, but it's possible to do that as well. Let's go for the NSubstitute, which is, I really like this package. In my projects, I always use NSubstitute for mocking, for everything related to the test. Let's just remove these lines. And then in substitute, let's say user service. Substitute. So usually when we want to mock an interface, we can use the for method, and then usually we can mock methods for this interface, right? When we try to mock only part of the class, actually we have another method here called for PartOf. Substitute is saying that create a substitute for this class that behaves just like real one, but we can change the behavior of one of the methods or a few of the methods. So that if we don't mock any of the methods, is nothing different between this mock and the main one. It's just the real code here. But as we mentioned, we want to mock this method. And if we are going to say user method that gets, okay, I cannot see that method. That is obviously correct because our method is protected. This is another trade-off for using the NSubstitute. If you want to use PartOf mocking for the class and NSubstitute, you have to make it public. This is kind of discussion, we should not change the code base for writing tests. That's, correct and not correct. Depends on your way of writing tests and the way of trading off. This kind of things always we can have. And also because of protection level, maybe you say, for sure I'm not going to make this method public because I have something encapsulated in this class, which is fine. The only way to do that is using watermark. If you are going to keep it private, because you cannot even override in that inherit class, that's fine. But here for NSubstitute, this method is really interesting. Although even in the website, it says you need to use it carefully. Let's do it here for, this is the way for mocking the method. So we are going to say for any string parameters that we are calling this method, we are going to just simply return this result, id1 followers 100. Why is just simplify, right? Okay, another point here, when you are trying to use this PartOf method with the substitute, you have to provide the constructor for this class. Think about like this, how this mocking library works. In case of using interface, they are just creating their own implementation, implement that interface, and then just mocking all the methods in that interface. But in this case, when you want to mock a class, they are going to instantiate that class, so that when they want to instantiate the class, you have to provide constructor parameters. So that we have this HTTP client factory, and we need to provide HTTP client factory, but it's not the simply create of one of the objects or implementation of HTTP client factory, because we have registered this kind of things here. This is for adding named HTTP client, but we need to use the real one that we already registered here. So maybe you say, because we are using only this HTTP client factory in get user from GitHub, so that we don't need it, which is correct. We can actually add another parameterless constructor. But in real world application, you have another parameter in your constructor as well, like iLogger or other services. So here I'm gonna create one scope, and okay, also getting the get required service HTTP client factory, which is the real one that we already registered in our dependency injection container. So we are just getting that from DI. Nothing to worry about the type, the different parameter. Just get it from the dependency injection. We already set up our user services with mock only one of the methods. And then again, we are going to remove all of the iServices here, and simply we can say, yes, we can register this mock class, and then just for the iUser interface, we are using that. As I mentioned, all of the other methods here will execute as is. I mean, it's the actual code. We are just going to skip one method of it. Let's put some breakpoint here, and this one should not hit. Let's run the test again. This method is calling the real one. Also, this method as well, actual code. But once we are going to call this method, it just return our mock model, followers 100 and ID1. We didn't go for the implementation for calling our third-party API. So this is the beauty of the NSubstitute. Our test passed, and we are making sure that we don't call the third-party API. As I mentioned, there is multiple ways to achieving this goal for not calling some third-party APIs. Usually, if this is only the calling the third-party APIs, I go for watermark, which is really nice. But one of the very specific challenges that I had was we were using the Kafka, and for the server, we were using kind of certificate and using the SSL to connect to the Kafka. When we deployed that Kafka, all the app settings using the SSL and was working fine. But once we were trying to write the integration test, even using the test container for running the Kafka image, the test container for the Kafka don't support the SSL or using the other protocol to connecting. So you just need to use the simple one, simple connection string actually. What we could do, I had to use this PartOf method for mocking only one of that method that we adding the SSL configuration to connecting to the Kafka. Was really helpful for me, and I didn't use any extra code or adding the test classes. Just we use this method and then mock that login or setting up the connection string. That was really helpful. This one is really interesting. I just wanted to show you how you can mock PartOf classes. You can do lots of interesting things with the substitute for the mocking. If you don't know how to mock the interfaces or classes using NSubstitute, please leave a comment for me. I try to create another video about it. So that's it for now. Thank you for your time.